So, Medusa. You know this one. Beautiful woman, priestess of Athena, devoted to the goddess, living and serving in her temple. And then Poseidon, god of the sea, assaults her. In the temple, in Athena's own sacred space. And Athena, rather than going after the god who just violated her temple, punishes Medusa instead. Turns her into a monster. The beautiful woman gets snakes for hair, skin that goes grey, a gaze that turns anyone who looks at her directly into stone. She ends up living on the edge of the world, in a cave, where nobody has to look at her, and she doesn't have to look at anyone. And then Perseus shows up. He's been sent to kill her by a king who wants him out of the way and figures this is a decent enough way to do it. He gets help from Athena, gets a mirrored shield so he can look at Medusa's reflection without meeting her gaze directly, finds her asleep and beheads her. Takes the head. It gets used as a weapon a few more times before it eventually ends up bolted permanently to Athena's armor, basically doing the job of a magical keep-away sign for anything evil. That's the myth most people have in their heads. For them, that's just Medusa. Over the last couple of decades, another take on the story has exploded through social media and modern retellings. Medusa becomes a symbol of women blamed for what was done to them and of the way power protects itself. The snakes and the stone gaze become armor. Her face on those shields and temple walls becomes the face of someone with every reason to be dangerous. You see that reading in novels, poetry, and online conversations about myth, gender, and power. People find something genuinely meaningful in it, and I get that. I'm not going to sit here and say it doesn't hit hard. It does. It makes total sense that people connect with it. Here's my problem with it, though. I went and looked at the sources, the actual sources, and what I found is that most people are treating the whole version, the priestess, the assault, the unjust punishment, as ancient Greek mythology. At best, it's a story from a Roman poet writing in Latin around the year 8 AD, 700 years after the Greeks had already worked out what Medusa was. And at worst, and this is the part that actually blew my mind, some of the most important details aren't even from that Roman guy. They got added way, way later, just by people trying to fill in the blanks that the original story left wide open. The priestess thing? Not in the source. The idea that Athena punished Medusa to protect her? Also not in the source. Not in the ancient texts we have. Those details, the exact things that make this modern version hit so hard, were invented. Not by ancient Greeks, not by Romans, not by medieval scholars poring over old manuscripts. By us. By modern popular culture, pretty recently, working backwards from a story that was already a rewrite. Right, so let's start with the priestess, because that detail, Priestess of Athena, is doing the most important work in the whole modern version of this story. It's the reason Athena's response feels like a betrayal rather than just a harsh punishment. If Medusa was devoted to Athena, if she'd given her life to the goddess's service, then what Athena does isn't just cruel, it's a monstrous abuse of trust. An employer turning on an employee at the worst possible moment. That's what gives the modern version its teeth. So I went and looked up what Ovid actually wrote, because Ovid is the source for this story, the assault in the temple, the transformation, all of it. His book is called The Metamorphoses, and the Medusa story is in book 4. Here's what it says at the relevant bit. The Latin is, in templo Minervae, in the temple of Minerva. That's literally all he gives you about who Medusa was before the assault. She was in the temple. That's it. No priestess, no vow of chastity, no devoted servant of the goddess, just in the temple. Now you might think, okay, but maybe that's a translation issue. Maybe later translators added that detail without realizing they were editorializing. So I checked. Arthur Golding translated the Metamorphoses into English in 1567. No priestess. George Sandys in 1632. No priestess. Samuel Garth and Dryden's version in the early 1700s. No priestess. Every translator who worked directly with Ovid's text across 5 centuries read it the same way. A beautiful woman, an assault in a temple, a punishment. No cultic role. I went further back. The scholars who wrote commentaries on Ovid in the centuries after he died, late antiquity, the medieval period, the Renaissance, went through this text line by line. Servius, Fulgentius, Boccaccio, Natale Conti. These are people whose entire job was explaining and unpacking Ovid's myths in exhaustive detail. None of them calls Medusa a priestess. So how old is that extra job title? Older than I expected. A classicist called John Henry found 2 printed examples from 1885 and 1888 that casually call Medusa Athena's priestess. They're both reading Ovid's scene, not passing on some ancient detail he actually gave them. Medusa is in Athena's temple, so they supply the job title. And I want to be clear about what probably happened here, because it's kind of fascinating in a slightly horrifying way. People read Ovid's story and hit a logical gap. Athena punishes Medusa for being assaulted in her own temple. But why does Athena take it so personally unless Medusa had some specific obligation to her? A random woman being assaulted in a temple is awful. It doesn't immediately explain why the goddess responds the way she does. A priestess being assaulted, someone who'd taken a vow of chastity, who was under Athena's protection specifically, that fills the gap. It makes the dynamic cohere. So people filled it. Unconsciously, mostly. Honestly, there's something almost impressive about it. The gap was so logically obvious, the fill so emotionally satisfying, that it became easy to read the detail back into the story. By the time you meet it online or in a modern retelling, Medusa was a priestess of Athena can feel so obviously true, you'd be surprised if anyone challenged it. Except it's not in the text. It was never in the text. And the reason it was never in the text is that Ovid didn't need it to be. He wasn't writing a story about Medusa's relationship with Athena. He was writing a story about transformation, about what happens when a god decides your body is his. The priestess detail matters enormously to the modern version. It mattered not at all to what Ovid was actually doing, which means we've built the most emotionally loaded part of this story on a detail that nobody wrote. And if that's true for the priestess, the thing the whole modern version rests on, it's worth asking what else got filled in the same way. As it turns out, quite a bit. The bit that turns the priestess story from a weird little mistake into something much bigger is the date. By 8 AD, Ovid's Metamorphoses was essentially complete. That's the book where Medusa gets the before and after that everybody now knows. The beautiful woman, the temple, the change, the snakes, 8 AD. Now, put that beside the earliest surviving full Greek account of Medusa, which comes from Hesiod, around 700 BC. We'll get to Hesiod. First, just look at that gap, about 700 years. If Ovid were doing this now, he would be taking a story whose earliest surviving version came from around the year 1326. That's the kind of time jump we're talking about. And somehow, the version written at the far end of that gap has ended up feeling like the original. One limit, though. 700 years doesn't mean Ovid was making things up in a vacuum. Greek myths have been traveling, changing, getting told in different places for centuries before anybody put a surviving version on paper. When somebody says, "it's in the source," this is usually the source they mean. A Roman poem written in Latin by a man called Publius Ovidius Naso. Ovid is one of those writers who gets reduced to a name on a school list, which is a shame because the actual project is kind of ridiculous, in the best possible way. The Metamorphoses runs for 15 books. It starts with the creation of the world. It keeps moving through Greek and Roman myth, all the way to Julius Caesar and Augustus. The whole thing is held together by one idea: bodies change. Someone becomes a tree, someone becomes a bird, someone becomes a spider. Gods change shape to get what they want. Human beings are changed because a god is angry, because someone has been seen, because a parent can't bear what happened. Ovid keeps coming back to that moment where a person stops being able to decide what their own body is going to be. That's the book Medusa walks into. And even then, it's wild how short the actual scene is. Ovid doesn't stop and give Medusa a whole book to herself. Her story turns up in book 4, inside Perseus's account of what happened to her. Somebody asks why her hair is snakes. Perseus answers. The bit of story that sparked this massive modern reaction is literally dropped in as an explanation during somebody else's conversation. The whole Medusa explanation is only around 50 lines in a poem of 15 books. That doesn't make it unimportant. It does mean we should stop imagining Ovid sitting down to write the Medusa myth as a complete, self-contained thing. He's in the middle of a much bigger run of stories, and he needs to explain why this one Gorgon has snake hair. A guest asks a question. Perseus gives an answer. Later readers take that answer out of this incredibly busy Roman poem, add details that aren't there, and it gradually becomes the Medusa story. Treat the Metamorphoses like an ancient encyclopedia, and you miss what it actually is. It's a poem. It has a narrator. It has scenes inside scenes. It chooses where to linger and where to move on. Ovid is taking stories his Roman audience already knew in various forms and arranging them for his own purposes. Romans had been doing this with Greek material for a very long time. Their gods had Roman names. Zeus becomes Jupiter, Athena becomes Minerva, Poseidon becomes Neptune. They did more than swap the names. A Roman poet could take a Greek story, put it into Latin verse, move the emphasis, give someone a motive, add a transformation, and make it feel like it had always been there. Ovid is so good at making a story feel complete that it becomes hard to see what he added. Think about what happened with the priestess. Ovid gives us a woman in Minerva's temple. He leaves the reason for Minerva's reaction hanging there. Much later, readers filled in the missing job title because it made the whole thing land harder. By the time that reaches a TikTok or a mythology website, Ovid is the ancient Greeks, Minerva is Athena, and the priestess feels like it must have been there from the beginning. The story everyone tells today is built in 3 layers. Greek material, then Ovid's Roman version in Latin around 8 AD, then modern people adding a priestess and passing the finished version around as ancient fact. Once you've seen those layers, they need to stay visible. And the first 2 layers are already very far apart. By the time Ovid gets to Medusa, there are centuries of material behind him. He is making something new out of a story that had already had a very long life. There wasn't one approved Greek Medusa story. Poets change things. Artists change things. Cities told stories differently. Ovid had every right to write his version. His version gets mistaken for the thing it rewrote. And it gets mistaken for that constantly. You see, Greek myth says, before a summary of a scene that comes from a Roman poem, you hear people talk about Athena punishing her priestess. Then the conversation moves straight to Greek religion, as if all of those things came from the same moment and the same culture. But they didn't. Ovid deserves the credit he gets as a poet. He was writing at the center of the Roman world, under the Emperor Augustus. Rome had just come out of a brutal run of civil wars, and now one guy, Augustus, suddenly had the final say over an extraordinary amount of Roman life. People were still figuring out how to talk about that new political reality. The Metamorphoses ends by bringing its huge run of stories right up to Caesar's death and Augustus's rule. Rome is sitting there at the end of the poem as the latest thing the world has become. You don't need to turn every scene into a secret message about Augustus to notice the setting. Scholars still argue about whether Ovid was flattering the emperor or quietly taking the piss. We don't need to solve that here. What matters is that he was writing in a world where unaccountable, godlike power was very real. His book is full of people being changed by power they can't match. Sometimes it's a god, sometimes it's a parent, sometimes it's a king. Ovid can be funny, cruel, filthy, tender, and horrible, all in the space of a few pages. But he is fundamentally interested in what it feels like when a body becomes the place where somebody else's decision lands. So when Medusa appears in that poem, the transformation is doing work for Ovid's story. It belongs to a Roman poem about transformations, and we can't lose sight of that. The priestess claim showed us one modern addition. Ovid is the older layer underneath it. He's still ancient, obviously. Calling it all ancient gets dangerous when it makes an 800-year gap just vanish. So we need to go back before Ovid and see what the Greek material actually gives us. Athena is about to go into battle in the Iliad. She throws her aegis over her shoulders, and sitting right there on it, alongside panic and strife and every other thing you really don't want following you into a fight, is the head of the Gorgon. Homer calls it dreadful, grim, awful to look at. That's one of the first places this figure shows up in the Greek writing we still have. And the wild part is, Homer doesn't seem to care who she is. He doesn't give you Medusa the woman, or the temple, or Perseus walking in with a sword. He gives you a face on Athena's aegis, there to scare the other side. The Greeks had a name for that face, Gorgoneon. And the thing to get is, it isn't a portrait. It isn't a character you're meant to get invested in. It's a tool, a thing you put somewhere because it does a job. And the job is pretty obvious when you look at the actual art. Archaic Greek Gorgons have massive eyes, huge mouths, sharp teeth, sometimes a beard, sometimes the tongue is hanging out. They stare straight at you. The whole point is to make you take a step back. You start seeing that face everywhere. Temple roofs, shields, coins. They even painted it at the bottom of drinking cups, so it suddenly looks back at you the second you finish your wine. The Greeks kept putting it where something hostile might be coming toward them. There's a fancy word for this, apotropaic. It just means a scary image you use to keep bad things away. Think of it as a really old, really ugly keep out sign. The Gorgon head is there to look danger in the face before danger can get to you. So when you read that Homer scene, you realize he isn't treating the Gorgon like a monster who needs a backstory. His audience already knows what that face does. He can put it on Athena's aegis and move on. His audience recognizes it the second it appears. It's the same thing in the Odyssey. Odysseus is down among the dead, and he suddenly worries Persephone might send up the Gorgon's head from Hades. Again, it's just the head. Again, the point is fear. Homer doesn't explain it because he doesn't have to. And honestly, that's the big shock when you dig into this. Our modern Medusa story starts with a person. Homer's starts with a warning sign. Notice nobody calls her Medusa here. Homer says Gorgon. That's it. A terrifying face attached to divine power and the world of the dead. The name, the sisters, the whole human-looking tragedy we eventually get, all of that is still a long way off. This was the moment that really broke my brain. I went in expecting to find the rough, early draft of Medusa. Maybe fewer details, maybe a nastier version of the woman we know. Instead, I found something that barely works like a character at all. It's a face, a weapon, a ward. And once you see it like that, Athena wearing it stops looking like some weird little epilogue at the end of the story. In the oldest Greek material we have, the face is already on her. It's already doing its job. Homer doesn't tell us where it came from. He doesn't tell us why Athena has it. He just drops the image right in front of us. The aegis over her shoulders, panic and strife around it, and the Gorgon's face right in the middle. That face comes first. Okay, here's where it gets properly weird. Hesiod is the first Greek writer we have who actually gives us Medusa by name. And he introduces her with two sisters right out of the gate, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, three Gorgons living way out past ocean at the edge of the world near the Hesperides. So far, fair enough, three monster sisters. You can kind of see where this is going. But then Hesiod drops one line that changes absolutely everything. Medusa is mortal. Stheno and Euryale are immortal. They don't age, they don't die. Medusa does. And he gives you absolutely zero reason for it. There's no earlier life in the poem, no curse or crime or special weakness. He just states it as a fact and keeps going. That point gets lost when people say the Greeks had the same Medusa story all along. Hesiod introduces the Gorgons as daughters in a long, strange family line. Medusa arrives on the page already one of them. There isn't a before for him to fill in. People call this the original Greek version, which is fair enough as long as we don't pretend Hesiod hands us a neat, finished character sheet. This comes from a poem called the Theogony, which is basically this massive family tree of gods, monsters, rivers, nymphs, and anything else the Greek world thinks needs a parent. Hesiod is speeding through it. Phorcys and Keto have kids, the Graiai pop up, then the Gorgons, then their names, and then he just drops that one bizarre sentence about Medusa being the only sister who can die. He doesn't stop, he doesn't lean in to explain it, he doesn't give us the backstory we're all waiting for. That's literally it. And honestly, that tells you everything about where the actual focus is here. Medusa isn't the center of it yet. Perseus is. Because once you've got a hero who needs to prove himself, you need something he can actually kill. An immortal monster is a terrible target. Medusa is the one who can die, because this is the story where Perseus kills Medusa. Now, obviously, Hesiod never says that out loud. He doesn't say, I made her mortal so the hero would have a monster to kill. But it's pretty hard to miss what's happening. And the really odd part is that Hesiod gives Medusa more life after death than before it. He has Poseidon lie with her in a meadow. Then Perseus beheads her. And from her body come Pegasus and Chrysaor. Those two are huge in later Greek myth. Medusa, meanwhile, barely gets a sentence about being alive. The Greek story is colder. Medusa isn't a wronged woman with a past. She isn't even really a monster with a personality. She's a piece of a hero story. And I know that sounds harsh, but I don't think it's a dig at Hesiod. It's just where his attention goes. His poem wants to tell you who comes from who kills who, and why the world has all these gods and creatures in it. It doesn't stop for Medusa's inner life, because that isn't the part she plays here. She is a mortal Gorgon, one of three, the one Perseus can kill. That is the oldest full Greek Medusa story we've got, and it leaves a massive gap in the middle of the page. Why her? Hesiod doesn't tell us. Maybe the people hearing him already knew something he didn't bother to write down. Or maybe there just wasn't an answer. The poem we have gives us nothing, just three sisters at the edge of the world, two of them immortal, one of them mortal, and no reason why. Then a Greek poet calls Medusa fair-cheeked. The poet is Pindar. It's around 490 BC, so a couple of centuries after Hesiod. And that one adjective makes the Gorgon we know look very different. Because the Medusa we've had up to this point is a face on Athena's aegis, then a mortal Gorgon in a very cold family story. But Pindar looks at her and describes a beautiful face. And the weird thing is where this happens. This isn't even a poem about Medusa. It's a victory song for a musician called Midas, who's just won a contest playing the aulos, a Greek wind instrument. Pindar wants to talk about where that music came from, so he tells this side story about Athena. Perseus kills Medusa. Her two sisters hear it and start wailing. Athena hears them crying, then takes that sound and makes music out of it. And that's Pindar's whole Medusa scene. She's dead, her sisters are howling in grief, and Athena turns that horrible noise into music for somebody else's victory song. It's a really strange place to find genuine grief, but it's there. And somewhere in the middle of that, Pindar calls Medusa fair-cheeked. It's such a jarring thing to hear after Hesiod. Medusa is still dead. Perseus is still the hero here, and the poem is using the sisters' grief to explain a piece of music. But the grief is there. The beautiful face is there. You actually get to feel something for the Gorgons. Now, don't push that too far. Pindar hasn't turned her into Ovid's human woman. She's still a Gorgon, and the whole thing still runs on Perseus cutting off her head. But a Greek poet has looked at this terrifying creature and called her fair-cheeked. At the temple of Artemis on Corfu, there is a huge Gorgon carved around 580 BC. She stands right in the middle of the pediment, with her eyes staring out, her mouth wide, her teeth out, her body moving, and her face fixed on you. That's the old version. You don't feel invited to know her. You feel invited to leave her alone. Then look at the Medusa Rondinini. The statue we have is Roman, copying a Greek classical design, and her face is a young woman's face. The beard is gone, the big teeth are gone, the tongue is gone. She just looks calm, almost sad. Nobody held a meeting and decided Medusa was pretty now. Greek myths and Greek art didn't work like that. Over time, though, the face becomes more human. It gets easier to look at. The Gorgon gets easier to recognize as someone you might feel for. So Ovid didn't make the beautiful Medusa out of absolutely nothing. The Greek world had already started making room for her. Pindar's fair-cheeked Medusa, the sisters crying, the face in art slowly becoming more human. But even with all that, Pindar still doesn't give her a human life before the Gorgon story. There's no transformation. There's no reason why she's the one sister who can die. But it does tell us something important. The whole idea of Medusa starting as a human woman and turning into a monster first shows up in the writing we still have with Ovid. Before him, the sources we have give us a Gorgon who was already a monster, without a former life, or a temple scene, or a punishment. That makes Ovid the main character right now. He wrote the version the modern story is built on. The Greeks themselves didn't have one fixed Medusa story either. Different poets could tell the same figure differently. Vase painters could make a face look terrifying or beautiful. A story could travel from one city to another and pick up a different detail on the way. Ovid didn't need to be a liar for this to matter. What he gives us is a version, and that version has an author, a language, a date, and a place. That weird blank space around Medusa is exactly where Ovid is at his best. Hesiod gives you 3 sisters, tells you one of them can die, and never really explains why. Pindar lets you see a beautiful face, but she's still a Gorgon from the start. Ovid comes along and gives Medusa a life before any of it happened. One limit here. I can't tell you Ovid definitely dreamed up every bit of that by himself. There may have been a Greek or Hellenistic version that got lost. Some scholars think that's a real possibility, partly because his account is so brief. At one point, Ovid even says, "They say." Maybe that's him nodding at an older story. Maybe it's just how a poet tells a story. Nobody can settle it now, because there isn't an earlier version we can put beside his. The first one we actually have on paper that gives Medusa this whole human before the monster setup, is Ovid's. And this is what he gives her. Perseus is at a feast after rescuing Andromeda, and one of the guests asks why Medusa alone has snakes for hair. Perseus says that before that, she was famous for being beautiful. Of all the things about her, her hair was the one people talked about. Then Neptune assaults her in Minerva's temple. Minerva turns away and covers her face with her aegis. Then she changes Medusa's beautiful hair into snakes. And you really have to look at Ovid's exact words here. He says Minerva did it so the crime wouldn't go unpunished. He doesn't say she was protecting Medusa. He doesn't say the snakes were a gift. He calls it punishment. And then he says Minerva wears those same snakes herself to scare her enemies. Now, Hesiod did actually mention Poseidon. He says the god lies with Medusa in a meadow, and then Perseus kills her, and Pegasus and Chrysaor pop out. But it's all crammed into this dry family tree. No temple, no punishment, no moment where Medusa's actual life is the point of the scene. Ovid keeps the sea god, but moves the assault into Minerva's temple and makes it the event that changes her. That changes what the story cares about. Hesiod wants to know who comes out of Medusa after she dies. Ovid wants to know what happened before she became the thing Perseus kills. For the first time, the snake hair has a cause. Ovid doesn't spoon-feed it to us like a teacher at a chalkboard. He just gives Medusa a before, something done to her, and the moment she becomes the creature Perseus will eventually kill. That's enough for the old problem to stop feeling so random. And honestly, you miss what Ovid pulled off if you just call him a fraud. He takes a monster who barely gets a sentence about being alive and gives her a past. He takes the snake hair and makes it the aftermath of something. Pindar's beautiful face and Hesiod's mortal sister had both been sitting there. Ovid gives you a story where they belong together. He is still telling it through Perseus, which is kind of mad when you stop and think about it. The man who cuts off Medusa's head is the one explaining what happened to her. In Hesiod, Medusa is the thing Perseus kills. Once you get to Ovid, Perseus turns up at the end of something awful that has already happened to her. That doesn't make Ovid a modern feminist writer. He doesn't give Medusa a speech, and he doesn't let her tell you what she felt in that temple. It is still a short account, told by a man, inside someone else's story. But he gives her enough of a life that a reader can start asking a question the older Greek story barely opens up. What was done to her? I think this is a big part of why it took off. You get a beautiful young woman, a temple, a god using his power, and a goddess who looks away before she changes her. You don't need a huge family tree before the story hurts. The Greek version can be frightening, and Pindar can make it sad. But Ovid gives you a reason to be angry. That's a powerful thing to put into a myth. It also gives later storytellers room to argue. You can hate what Minerva does. You can try to imagine what Medusa wanted, or what she should have been given instead. Hesiod gives you a monster and a hero, then moves on. And it fits the book he's writing. We already know the Metamorphoses is full of bodies being changed because somebody more powerful has decided what happens to them. Sometimes that's a god. Sometimes it's a king. Sometimes it's a parent. Medusa arrives late in that poem, but she fits the pattern almost too well. Ovid gets there very fast because he starts with one concrete thing, her hair. He tells you it was beautiful, tells you exactly what happened to it, and suddenly there is a person underneath the Gorgon. Hair is close and personal. It's what somebody noticed about her before it became the thing everyone fears. Perseus even says he heard about it from someone who had seen it. That tiny detail makes her old beauty feel like something people remembered after it was gone. This isn't Ovid slapping a random sad backstory onto a famous monster. He is taking a beautiful face, snake hair, a mortal sister, and that old link with Athena, then arranging them so they hurt each other. The story gets tighter. It also gets crueler. The strange part is that he does all this while barely letting Medusa speak. She never gets to explain herself. The scene is handed to us by Perseus at somebody else's feast. So Ovid has moved the story closer to her without fully giving it to her. That tension is probably why the passage has kept people arguing with it for so long. Now, none of this makes Minerva's response kinder. The scene is still brutal. Neptune assaults Medusa. Minerva punishes Medusa. Then, later, Perseus kills her. Ovid gives her a past, but he doesn't give her justice. And I think that's part of why people keep trying to rewrite this bit. Ovid gives you enough to grab hold of, and the unfairness of it makes people want to fix it. Ovid doesn't fix it for us. He gives Medusa her beautiful hair, Minerva's temple, Neptune's assault, and the snakes. Later stories keep picking up that version. In 1975, a French writer named Hélène Cixous published an essay called Le Rire de la Méduse. The English version, The Laugh of the Medusa, followed the next year. It went on to become a defining text for a lot of feminist writing and theory. But if you actually read it, here's the strange part. Cixous never mentions Ovid. He isn't hiding in a footnote. He just isn't there. Open the essay and you don't find Minerva's temple, Neptune's assault, a priestess claim, or the snake hair punishment scene. Cixous isn't trying to work out what the ancient Greeks originally believed. She's after something else. Her whole argument is that women need to write themselves back into the world and into history, instead of letting somebody else decide what their bodies and voices mean. Medusa shows up as one sharp image inside that much bigger argument. And when she does, Cixous just says, she's beautiful and she's laughing. The woman everyone has been taught to fear looks straight back, and the fear starts to look ridiculous. Cixous even pictures Perseus backing away from her. Medusa is already out of his reach. Ovid gives you a woman who has been hurt, punished, and then killed. Cixous gives you a figure who is alive, laughing, and making the people around her look scared. She takes this old symbol of female danger and makes her look right back at the people who are afraid of her. Once Ovid's wounded woman and Cixous' laughing woman get put in the same conversation, the history gets tangled. Cixous can start to look like she took the Roman story and gave it an empowering ending. She didn't. Cixous was doing her own thing with Medusa. She was trying to change how women talk about themselves and their bodies. She wasn't trying to file a report on Greek religion. Calling her historically wrong misses the point, because she was never trying to be an archaeologist. Later writers and readers do bring the two together. That gives you a Medusa who can hold the anger of what was done to her and still refuse to be ashamed or afraid afterwards. Ovid supplies the wound. Cixous supplies the laugh. That blend can be powerful. It gives people words for things the old myth leaves brutally unresolved. It also changes the history when it gets passed around, as though it was always one ancient story. And even within feminist writing, Cixous isn't the only answer. A scholar called Heidi Morse points to another kind of Medusa writing. Some writers go back to the old Gorgon face itself, the mask, the stare, the thing that never asks to be understood. Sometimes that old terrifying face does its own work just by staying silent and refusing to soften. You can actually watch this particular Medusa story turn up online almost in real time. Back in July 2013, I found a WordPress post called A Yogic Perspective to the Medusa Myth. The author, Rohit Arya, starts with the usual modern version. Medusa is Athena's priestess. Poseidon assaults her in the temple, and Athena turns her into a monster. But then he offers a different way to read it. Athena couldn't protect Medusa at first, he says, so the transformation was really Athena giving her power and safety afterwards. The snake hair and the deadly gaze become the thing that keeps any man from hurting her again. Now, to be fair, Arya is upfront that this is a yogic reading, not some lost Greek manuscript. He's a modern writer looking at a brutal story and trying to make the goddess involved seem a little less brutal. And honestly, that impulse makes sense. Ovid gives you an awful sequence. Neptune assaults Medusa, Minerva punishes Medusa, and then Perseus kills her. You look at that and think, surely there's got to be another way to read Athena. But if you actually open Ovid, the rescue plan just isn't there. Minerva turns Medusa's hair into snakes, so the act in her temple won't go unpunished. Later, she wears those same snakes herself to frighten her enemies. You won't find a line saying Medusa asked for this, or that Minerva did it for her safety. The older Greek stories aren't going to help you either. In Hesiod, Medusa is born a Gorgon. There's no temple scene, no transformation, and no Athena stepping in at all. Was that 2013 post the first time anyone had this idea? Maybe not. But it's one early version we can actually put a date on. And it shows the protection reading as what it is, a modern answer to how unfair Ovid's story feels. That post already has the priestess claim in it too. Once Medusa becomes Athena's devoted follower and Athena's punishment becomes a gift, the whole story starts to feel morally survivable. The version often presented as most empowering still gives the decisive choice to Athena. Medusa gets power, sure. Somebody else decides what has to happen to her body, and Medusa never gets to say yes. That is a long way from Siksu. The protection version can still work as a retelling. It gives Medusa a different kind of story. Just don't call it what Ovid says, or what the Greeks believed. By the time it gets passed around as Greek myth, you have Ovid's temple and assault, a priestess added later, and a protective curse added later still. Every change makes the story kinder. Every change also takes it farther from the text people say they are repeating. The trouble only really starts when a modern reading stops calling itself a reading and starts getting called ancient Greek myth.